For most people, fertilizer is invisible. You don't think about it when you buy a bag of rice or a pack of chicken or a chocolate bar. But every bite of modern food is built on three ingredients that nobody eats: nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. They're the chemical backbone of global agriculture. Without them, yields collapse and food systems fall apart. If oil is the lifeblood of global industry, fertilizer is the quiet oxygen of civilization. And in the past 4 years, China has quietly taken control of more of that oxygen than almost anyone realized. A nitrogen shortage is not a headline. A phosphate export ban is not the kind of thing journalists fight to cover. But these are the small hinges on which very large doors swing. And right now, one of the world's largest agricultural suppliers is closing those doors and bolting them from the inside. The global story begins with something deceptively simple. To grow enough food for 8 billion people, the world needs a constant, uninterrupted flow of NPK. It's the trinity of modern farming. Nitrogen feeds leaf and grain growth, phosphate builds roots and energy transfer, potash strengthens water use and disease resistance. You can plant a field with no fertilizer, but you won't like what comes out of it. The Green Revolution didn't happen because of good weather or good intentions. It happened because industrial fertilizer became cheap and abundant. And yet, the global supply of fertilizer is not abundant at all. It's extremely concentrated. A handful of countries dominate each segment, and one of them, China, has gradually emerged as the indispensable supplier for the developing world. China is the largest producer of nitrogen fertilizers, the largest producer of phosphate, and a giant consumer of all three. Nearly a third of the world's fertilizer is consumed by China itself. When China buys more, the world gets less. When China stops exporting, the world feels it immediately. This wasn't a problem a decade ago. Through the 2010s, China exported the leftover fertilizer it didn't use domestically. Global markets knew the drill. Buy from China in bulk, buy from Russia or Morocco as insurance, and pray the spring planting season didn't collide with a logistics crunch. But in 2021, something changed. China began to worry about something it worries about more than anything else: food security. Food inflation was rising. Energy prices were volatile. Swine fever had already rattled pork supplies. And Beijing decided it would not allow global demand to dictate domestic agricultural stability.
The result was the first wave of export controls. It didn't sound dramatic at the time. Licensing requirements, customs inspections, quota management, but the effect was immediate. Chinese urea exports dropped almost by half. Phosphate shipments slowed to a crawl, and global prices exploded. Farmers from Brazil to Ethiopia woke up to fertilizer prices that doubled, even tripled. Traders blamed Russia's war in Ukraine. They blamed natural gas spikes. Those were real drivers, but the China factor sat underneath all of it, a quiet restriction that never fully lifted. In 2023, China opened the tap briefly. Exports of urea and DAP surged by more than 40%. Brazil and India cheered. Global prices stabilized. It looked like China might return to its pre-pandemic role as the market shock absorber, but the window didn't stay open for long. By late 2023, Beijing began tightening again. A new round of inspections, a pause on new DAP and MAP exports, and then, in early 2024, the most dramatic shift yet. Nitrogen exports fell by more than 90%. For a country of China's size, that wasn't a policy tweak. It was a strategic decision. Beijing had adopted a domestic-first doctrine. The logic was clear enough. Why let global markets bid fertilizer away from Chinese farmers? Why tolerate domestic food price volatility when the world needed China's fertilizer more than China needed the world's goodwill? If you're running a country of 1.4 billion people, that's not national selfishness, that's national triage. But the outside world doesn't experience it as triage. It experiences it as a choke point. To understand the pressure this created, start in Brazil, where soybeans and corn now underpin the country's entire export powerhouse. Brazil imports roughly 85% of its fertilizer. For urea, the dependence is closer to 90%. And guess who Brazil depends on? China. Russia is a major supplier too, but China's sudden stop-go pattern turned the entire logistics chain into a guessing game. One month, Brazilian cooperatives were receiving Chinese DAP containers at bargain rates. The next month, those ships vanished from the schedule. Brazil has money, it has credit, it has fuel. What it doesn't have is a domestic fertilizer base. So, prices spike, farmers delay purchases, margins thin, and the government starts reopening nitrogen plants that had been shut for years because suddenly a country famous for agricultural abundance is realizing that abundance rests on someone else's exports. India is even more exposed. India's agricultural system has 2 points of insecurity: rainfall and phosphate. Rainfall you can't control. Phosphate you absolutely can, only if you have access to it. India buys huge volumes of DAP every year, and during China's brief export easing in 2023, nearly 40% of India's DAP imports came from Chinese producers. It was a windfall. Stocks rose, prices eased. Then, just months later, the trapdoor opened. China tightened DAP exports again. Indian cargoes were held up at ports. Stocks fell by almost half compared to the previous year. New Delhi didn't panic, but it did something it always does when fertilizer markets tighten. It wrote enormous subsidy checks to prevent farmers from rioting.
To the average Indian farmer, nothing looks stranger than being told the world has plenty of phosphate rock, while the bag of DAP in their district suddenly costs more than their monthly income. But that's the reality of a choke point economy. The world doesn't trade phosphate rock, it trades ammoniated phosphate. And China processes a huge share of the world's ammoniated phosphate, and increasingly diverts it to a different priority: electric vehicle batteries. Lithium iron phosphate, the heart of China's battery dominance, competes directly with African smallholders for the same phosphate molecule. Africa is where the fertilizer crunch becomes a food security crisis. Sub-Saharan Africa already uses only a fraction of the global average fertilizer rate, often less than 20 kilograms per hectare. That's barely enough to maintain soil fertility, let alone raise yields. So when fertilizer prices spike, usage falls even further. And when usage falls, harvests stagnate. In countries where half a family's income is spent on food, a 10% price increase is a catastrophe. A 40% increase is destabilizing. When Chinese exporters step back, Africa feels it instantly because there is no buffer, no subsidy, no margin for error. The global market has not collapsed. There is no worldwide famine, but the structural risks have multiplied. When one of the world's largest suppliers treats fertilizer exports as a dial that can be turned up or down depending on domestic politics, that introduces a volatility the developing world cannot absorb indefinitely. Analysts sometimes describe this as China weaponizing fertilizer. That's too sharp. China is not trying to starve anyone, but it is doing something far more unnerving. It is reorganizing global fertilizer supply around its own internal priorities, and everyone else must adjust. Beijing wants stable food prices, stable farmer incomes, stable rural employment, and stable fertilizer inventories. Those are political goals, not agricultural ones. And because China is the kind of economy that can bend global markets by moving a customs officer's stamp from one desk to another, the rest of the world experiences those domestic priorities as external shocks. So, is this a famine trigger, or is it just a painful supply squeeze? The answer is not binary. A country like Brazil won't go hungry because of fertilizer shortages, but it may plant fewer acres, lose margin, and raise the cost of the soybeans that feed Asia's poultry and livestock industry. India won't starve, but it may pay billions in subsidies to keep its political system intact. And Africa won't suddenly see mass famine, but it will see higher food prices, reduced fertilizer use, and more rural households pushed to the edge of survival. This is how global crises often begin, not with a spectacular collapse, but with a long chain of small compounding fractures. The world is not sitting still. Brazil is building its own nitrogen and potash facilities. India is diversifying towards Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, and experimenting with nano-urea and new fertilizer technologies. Africa is attracting large-scale nitrogen investments in Nigeria and Ethiopia.
Russia, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia continue to expand export capacity. Everyone is hedging against a world in which China's fertilizer exports are never predictable again.
But there's a deeper transformation happening beneath the surface. For decades, globalization allowed countries to specialize. Brazil grew soybeans, China made fertilizer, the Middle East made ammonia, Canada mined potash. It worked because the system was predictable. Now the system is fragmenting. Fertilizer is becoming a strategic commodity, not a boring industrial input, and governments are treating it like energy, like rare earths, like semiconductors, something you cannot rely on other people to provide when politics get tense. Which brings us back to the central idea: China eats first. It's not a moral statement, it's a structural reality. China has 1.4 billion mouths to feed, and a political system that remembers famine as a living trauma, not an academic topic. When forced to choose between stabilizing global agricultural markets and stabilizing domestic food prices, China will choose itself every time. And as long as China accounts for such a large share of global nitrogen and phosphate production, that choice radiates outward to countries that have no say in the matter. The Global South is stepping into a decade shaped by fertilizer scarcity, rising costs, and inconsistent supply. Weather shocks, wars, and climate volatility will magnify the effect. The world may never face a sudden fertilizer-driven famine, but we may face something arguably more destabilizing: rolling food price crises, regional shortages, political unrest, and a constant scramble for alternative suppliers. If energy crises define the headlines, fertilizer crises define the quiet arithmetic of survival. That's where the story is moving, even if few are tracking it, because behind every loaf of bread, every bowl of rice, every ton of animal feed, there is a supply chain that can be disrupted by a single export license in a Chinese port. The world is learning a difficult truth. China doesn't have to weaponize fertilizer to transform global agriculture. It only has to prioritize itself, and it has already begun. This is the world's new agricultural reality, a reality where inputs, not land, not water, not seeds, are the ultimate bottleneck. A reality where the world's largest food consumers now shape the fate of the world's smallest farmers. A reality where fertilizer, the most boring of commodities, has suddenly become the hinge on which the stability of dozens of countries rests. China eats first. Everyone else competes for what remains, and in that scramble lies the next great geopolitical story of food, power, and survival.